Hello, family. It's your sister Jocelyn here, and welcome to another episode of Faith on the Journey. If this is your first time tuning in, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here and want you to know that we're committed to helping you strengthen your faith, heal your heart, and discover a sense of community. And we do so through a variety of ways by connecting you with a team of Christian counselors and offering trauma healing trainings across the country. You can learn about these resources and so much more by visiting our website at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. Now, today I'm excited to welcome to the show two powerhouses for the kingdom of God who wrote an incredible book called Even the Best of Us: Clergy, Sexual Failure, the Church's Hidden Sin. And when I learned about this book, I'm like, I need to have them on my show to talk about this vital topic because this is something that needs to be addressed. And so I have two co authors with me. First, reading Dr. Perry, Dr. Dwight Perry, his background. He's a seasoned leader with over 44 years of dedicated service and full time ministry. He has a diverse background that spans various ministerial roles, including senior pastorship and executive leadership at the Baptist General Conference, now Converge, currently serving as the senior vice president, dean of education, and provost at Moody Bible Institute. Dr. Perry continues to exemplify leadership in his ongoing mission and his work. And then we also have Dr. Elizabeth Pierre, who is an associate professor of pastoral care and counseling and psychology at North Park University, Seminary and School of Professional Studies. She's also a licensed professional counselor, currently practicing in Chicago. Her research is specializing in trauma-informed care, especially around sexual violence survivors and how that impacts their lives and the path of recovery. And so we're so blessed and honored to have these two beautiful people here on the show with us today. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Well, thank you.
You. Thanks so much, Reverend Jocelyn. Hi, Dr. Perry.
How you doing, Dr. Pierre?
Oh, you all are just two old friends
Yes.
who came together. And I know it's more than just a friendship. You have
Mhm.
so many different ways that you work together, but you came together for this incredible project that we're going to talk about today. And so I have a number of questions for you to ask around your book and your work. And the first question I'm actually going to direct to Dr. Perry in terms of what inspired you to co-write a book on clergy sexual failure in the church, and why is it so important for this topic to be addressed in book form?
Hmm. Well, thank you so much, Reverend Jocelyn. Um, my field of study is applied theology. And over the years, as I've done research and written books in different areas, the Lord kept prompting me, however, to say, there's an area that you really need to address that it has not been addressed in a balanced way in terms of clergy failure. Unfortunately, we live in a cancel culture. We live in an environment, even among the church, that when someone fails, that's it. And there are circumstances where a minister will be disqualified, especially if it's involving children and some of those other issues. But I'm a firm believer that not only for the minister who has fallen, but also for the survivor and for the church, there needs to be a biblical and theological and also uh, practical guidebook to help them to come back to wholeness and health. And so that's why I decided to write this book. To be very honest with you, this book was hard to write. It really was.
Sure.
It took me, I've written 8 books in total, but this took me several years to get the courage to ask Dr. Pierre to help me. When she came on the scene, then I felt I had some energy to do it. So that really was the context.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And you had the missing piece with Dr. Pierre to come on board. And so Dr. Pierre, when you were approached by Dr. Perry about this opportunity, how did you feel? What made you say, okay, I'm going to say yes to this project?
First is Dr. Perry, who's a mentor and such just a godly leader and authentic and a person of integrity. So I'm always encouraged by that. And so I saw his heart for it. And so that was, and he's just, and again, I just think the world of Dr. Perry. Secondly, I have worked with folks along as a pastor, because I served with pastors for several years, and as a clinician, but also my research, my dissertation was on sexual violence and among women of faith, Black women of faith. And what I noticed, whether regardless of whether there were people of color or not, the recurring thing was like how many women, especially though men have also been abused, felt so isolated they couldn't share their stories, especially if it was a clergy person, because they often were ostracized. If they called out anyone, they were the ones like, well, if something's wrong with you, then you need to leave. And then they just felt alone. And then now they were left in isolation and shame, carrying this weight of like, well, I thought I could get the support from my community. Now I no longer have it. And so I just really felt like and one of the biggest things around any type of abuse, if you do not disclose it and you're isolated, the symptoms are exacerbated.
Hmm.
And so
Mm.
to have that space to feel comforted and encouraged and supported is actually more detrimental than people think, especially when it's a faith community.
Yes, it's compounded with your trauma and then almost like a spiritual abuse that can take place
Yes.
to
Yeah.
compound that. We're gonna get more into that, momentarily, but I'm glad you accepted the call, even if this project was hard and it took years to create. God's timing is perfect. And as it relates to one of the subjects that you address, and I'll direct this actually to you, Dr. Pierre, you describe pornography addiction as something that must be addressed within the church. What are some consequences that the church can experience if the pastor struggles with a pornography addiction?
I think churches don't realize how pornography actually changes your brain. Okay. I mean, the makeup, our brain likes things that makes us feel good. And so seeing the images of the pornographic images incites us because it's not necessarily being excited by something, not necessarily bad, but when it's pornography, it actually is not helpful because you want more of it. And it then you start objectifying people instead of seeing them as humans, as people made in the image of God. And then you have this other layer where that pornography also isolates because there's so much shame around it. So the pastor who's dealing with this is like, okay, now I'm struggling with this. I don't have anywhere to go. People are expecting me to be perfect, but I'm not. And so it comes like this vortex of shame and addiction and shame, and they become more and more isolated until they end up doing something. Because the thing with pornography, the need because the brain sort of like adjusts to the what you're seeing, and so it's not enough anymore. So you want something stronger and something more intense. And that's when usually pastors are found out. They end up start stepping out or not just viewing it, but start making phone calls, having people come over to their house because now the need is longer. And so it's like a domino effect. It starts affecting your relationships, your brain, your mind, ultimately relationship with God. And again, when you're in leadership, it's often lonely. And I think we'll talk about this later. I know you mentioned this, Reverend Jocelyn, but we need to let pastors know that, listen, you're human, you struggle. The first exposure to pornography is at 12 years old.
Wow.
12.
Early, your brain is still so in this developmental stage.
So
Oh.
given that, so then then just know that then most of the people in leadership have been exposed to it. Whether or not they are addicted to it, it's one thing. So can we just be honest about it so we make sure our pastors get support?
Mhm. Yes. And that's the thing, the support that's needed, but it's first actually reaching out, and for pastors, that could be so difficult. And we'll get into that. We're getting ahead of ourselves here, but
Yeah.
yes, that is spot on. So, Dr. Pierre, you stated that there is a unique trauma that's experienced when clergy actually engages in sexual misconduct. When it's clergy in particular, it's a unique type of trauma. Can you speak to that?
First of all, I want to be clear. Any type of abuse is awful. Okay. But most abuse happens by someone you know. Period. Research. And when it's a clergy, someone who's off to be represents God, a place of safety, a place of refuge, a person you go to prayer for, abuses their power, it disorients you. Like, well, I'm supposed to pray to this person and support this person, and you're the one telling me you're abusing me in this way. It shakes and disrupts the person's faith. Well, then God, what can I trust? Who can I trust if this person of God is not caring for me but hurting me? So again, you talked about earlier, there's multiple layers, like, oh, I thought people say, especially go to the pastor, let them pray for you, go to the clergy person. But when I go to them, they're hurting me. So then who can I turn to?
Yes, it's the cognitive dissonance is so
Exactly.
confusing for
Hmm.
that. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Dr. Perry, if is there anything you want to add to that as it relates to that question?
Well, I think Dr. Pierre has really summarized it well. A clergy person in most traditions, and I want to maybe be more specific, in the African American tradition, holds an immense role of power. There's a saying in the Black church that when the pastor speaks, God speaks. Now, obviously, we have to be careful with that type of theological framework because really is when the Bible speaks, God speaks. But I understand what we're saying and what our tradition is. And so, if that's true in some people's mind, which it is, there not only is there the devastation of sexual misconduct, there's the devastation of sexual misconduct from God's messenger. And the pain of that is unbearable, not just for the person being victimized, but also the pain of that is very unbearable if that particular clergy person has a family themselves, and and also for the family of God that they lead.
Oh, man, and I'm just feeling I'm empathizing with those who survived this because of how it really does it can damage someone's spiritual walk. It could really be a huge setback because of God's messenger, as you framed it, from that theological view. That is doing something like this, and so I'm wrestling with this.
I just wanted to say, because you just mentioned it, like I think of that scripture, better a millstone tied around their neck than someone to, lead these ones astray. Because people will walk away from the faith. They're like, well, this is what the church is about or God's about. I don't want to, and that breaks God's heart.
It does, and I think just wrestling with that because even though there are the pastor of the church, uh, they aren't God, and I think sometimes we might mistake because we put pastors on such a pedestal, and we think they should reflect God's love. Of course, we would think they would be different, but they are sinners. They're fallen people. Just like everyone else. And so it does confuse people. It does hurt them deeply because of what took place. And I'm going on a little tangent, so I'm gonna bring it back. So one of the things, and I'm going to direct this to Dr. Perry, that people will say sometimes in a situation like this is that the survivor of this type of abuse should have done more to protect themselves.
Mm.
Why can that thought process be damaging to the individual and the church at large?
Hmm. Well, it's extremely damaging. One main reason is because of the power dynamic between clergy and parishioner. In that relationship, it's not consensual, no matter what somebody might say. The clergy person has not only a spiritual authority, but also an emotional leverage over that person that, in my view, really diminishes their capacity to say, this is consensual. And um, it really grieves me, to be very honest with you, because we live in a world with hurting people who need the love of Christ, and they reach out to the church. And if the church is not healthy or the leadership's not healthy, that represents an unhealthy Christ, an unhealthy God, an unhealthy hope. And so many people have been turned away from a healthy God, a loving God, a God who is there to give them hope, not because he's not there, but because the people of God, and specifically clergy people, have not demonstrated that. I was with someone this week, and I'm going to be very general here, but I heard their testimony, and they come from a family where there was a single parent that led them, similar to my family, and they had multiple children in that family. And the parent was religious and wanted to seek God and went to a church. And these were children who saw some of the deacons begin to try to hit on this single mom. And it turned these children away from God. These were not even adults, but they just said, wait a minute, that's not kind of right, what I'm seeing. It's kind of, and thank God that the Lord several years later was able to pull this person back to himself. But it had a significant impact on that person.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. And unfortunately, there's so many other stories. Dr. Pierre, anything to add to that question?
Also very summarized it very well. And the only thing I just want to add is that I think as pastors, clergy, they need to know, yes, they're human, and they also have a call, and there is a cost to that call. Period. And so there are ways that you cannot be and engage. Like even if there's situations as the therapist and as a pastor, I've heard stories and testimonies and disclosures like where, well, this person came on to me. And you're the one who set the boundaries. You're the one who sets it. No matter what, that's not an excuse because you're the person with the power, as Dr. Perry said, that no matter what, and people that are, especially when you have a history of abuse, you're especially vulnerable. So any person who shows, even as a therapist, kindness to someone, people are like, oh my, does that mean something sexual? It doesn't. It's intimate, but not sexual. And so it is the pastor's responsibility to help distinguish it, just to make that the distinct distinguishment. Like this is intimate but not sexual, and I am not going to cross this boundary with you because I'm your pastor.
Yes, yes. Those boundaries are critical, and maybe towards the end of our interview, we can kind of talk about how we can create spaces and practices to have healthy boundaries. And this actually kind of leads me into my question for Dr. Perry around one of the issues that you raised in your book around the isolation and the lack of accountability that we see in churches for pastors or those in leadership. Why is that so dangerous?
Well, I wrote a paper several years ago now that I presented to my denomination, former denomination, and it's entitled Every Pastor Needs a Pastor. Some of us from my particular background call it a covering, that every pastor needs a covering. I wrote that paper toward the end of my tenure as the uh, uh, regional president of Converge Great Lakes, which is a 100+ church association where I was the first African American leader of that group. And so I had about not only 100 something congregations under me, but 20,000 people, a number of different things. And so in that role, unfortunately, you see things and you're involved in things. And the thing that I saw most, one of the things I saw most is how many ministers, and we talk about in the book, they put so much focus on the outward. They don't develop the inward, which means they don't understand that they need a covering. They need someone who not only they can go to, but their spouse can go to, okay, and say, this person is acting crazy right now, okay. And I remember one time when I cover pastors across the country and everything, even now. But I remember one time one of the pastors I covered, his wife, in this case, the spouse was a wife. His wife contacted me, and that began a series of things to really help that person. And so I really am grieved by the lack of understanding that even though clergy people are God's anointed, they're not God. they're not God. And the title of the book kind of gave a little hint of that. Even the best of us. All of us are only one step away from a failure. And if you think you're not, the Bible's very clear. Take heed. If you think you stand, lest you fall. And it grieves me when we don't have leaders who allow themselves to be pastored by other leaders. You know, when I was in charge of that large denominational entity, I had a covering pastor. He's the same person I have today. I can say his name. He won't be offended. Dr. Lucius Forward. He's a real person. Okay. Okay. I'm going to his 80th birthday coming up. Now, he will be mad that I said that. Okay. And he's still pastoring. He pastors right here in Chicago. He's been the senior pastor of that particular church for 40 years now. He's very active. So don't think of us old people as not active. Okay. He's very active. Okay. And he's my covering pastor. No matter where you are in leadership, from my point of view, if you can't be led, you're opening yourself up to some very, very dangerous consequences. And I'm passionate about that, to be very, very honest with you. I believe in the local church. I'm a part of a church here in Chicago called Progressive Baptist Church. It's a wonderful church. Dr. Charlie Dates is a pastor. And I submit in that context as well. You know, even though I was the person that helped Dr. Dates get into ministry 20 years ago. He's a much younger man than me. But I honor the office of the pastor, but in a way that's not to make them God, but to understand that I need spiritual protection myself.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful. It's critical. I think that it's overlooked. And as you were talking, Dr. Perry, I was thinking about how you could be so engrossed in the work of ministry that you were spiritually bankrupt. You were like going through the motions. And that's why it's vitally important, it's crucial for pastors to be pastored, to be covered, as you say. And so as we explore this conversation, I want to kind of shift into some solutions. What are some things that the church can do? And I'm going to start off with Dr. Perry addressing this to help to create systems, practices, policies to help guard against the sexual misconduct.
Well, I love my particular faith tradition. I come from a faith tradition that has somewhat been have independent, autonomous churches. And that's nothing wrong with that. But the downside of that is even churches need communities. They need to be, in my opinion, they need to be connected to denominational or other types of networks that can, when things happen, they can have outside intervention come in that would have spiritual authority. To just be a part of something but not submit to it is foolishness to me. Okay. And I think too many churches, especially from the Baptist independent framework, which is my framework, okay. Well, we're an autonomous Baptist church, now, I wonder what Jesus would think about that. I wonder what Jesus would think about how he created the body so that, as Ephesians says, we really build up one another and depend on one another. I wonder what Jesus would think about this misunderstanding of autonomy, which says autonomy is independence in arrogance instead of the ability to govern my own affairs.
Ooh, you not holding your tongue, Dr. Perry. Say that one more time for me. What did you just say?
That autonomy is independence in arrogance instead of understanding that autonomy means we can be self-governing in terms of our affairs. Okay. And so too many churches, and it's a myth. It's not in the Bible. Okay. It's more of an American cultural lie that says we have to do it ourselves. We have to be independent. None of us are like that. We all need community. We all need one another. Uh, you know, my wife and I love Dr. Elizabeth. We really do. And my wife, Dr. Cynthia, is one of the strongest women I know. Okay. Okay. And we've been married, be 45 years coming up in May. Okay. And the only reason why it's been 45 years is because of Dr. Cynthia. Okay. So not only do we need strong leadership on the outside, I need strong leadership from Dr. Cynthia. And we need one another. This book would not have been written without Dr. Pierre. You already can see the depth, the passion for this area. Not only that, but the research and the knowledge base. Okay, and so it'd be foolish for me to think, oh, okay, well, I got a PhD too, but not in her areas of expertise, and I'm not as smart as her, so it doesn't matter. Okay. You know, they they were trying to push me out the door. I was in that program so long. I was taking some master's classes too. I mean, I was on the 7-year plan. Okay,
But you're right. We need each other.
we need each other. That's the point. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of being an old man now and kind of going,
No, it's so funny. I love everything that you had to say.
Absolutely. Same here.
Yes, yes, and actually, I want to shift to you, Dr. Pierre, to talk about your expertise. As he mentioned, I appreciate this as a healing practitioner who is always looking at ways to explore the impact of trauma and how we can heal. And you spend a lot of time talking about the impact of trauma on God's people and this negative implications on emotional regulation. And so I want you to elaborate on why it's important for us not to suppress our feelings and emotion, and how that can have a negative impact on us if we do suppress our emotions.
Thank you for that question, Reverend Jocelyn. It ties in really well also with what Dr. Perry just said. I think as Christian people, ironically, we forget that we're embodied. Okay? Our whole theology, the incarnation, Jesus wasn't floating around. He came in a body. So he felt things. Things affected him. Even though he was God, he's God. And so when we hear so when someone hurts me, as much as I love Dr. Perry, and if Dr. Perry hits me in the face, as much as I love Jesus, I'm going to feel it and I'm going to have a bruise. So my prayer can't take away the bruise or the pain or whatever. And I think we need to go back to the basics that we're embodied, and our bodies are beautiful, and we're made in the image of God. And so whenever it's harmed, that means that there's not just a spiritual impact, there is, but there's a physical impact. And so when we don't, it's integrated. So, and the research is showing more and more how it's actually even in our cells. So when we're really, really stressed out, our cortisol level gets really up. God is how it's like we are such beautiful machines. And so if our cortisol is constantly up, it's our stress hormone, it really affects it. It's like we're constantly like, and that's not good for our heart when we're constantly in a hyper vigilant way and moving in that way. So when we're not working through our emotions, it actually gets stuck in our body. There's a famous book that just came out 2014, The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk. Highly recommended. It's an intense book, but highly recommended. But that when we don't process our emotions, our body's like, okay, you don't want to say it, but your body's going to remember it. So they're finding things like constant migraines, some cancers, not all, high blood pressure. All of that is connected, or realize there is a connection to not working through our emotions. So disclosure is the first step. And not a lot of treatment now is not just verbally. Therapy is important, but a lot of it's like somatic, working it through our bodies. And so a lot of therapy is moving towards that, not just words, but EMDR is a practice right now that people are using. It's called eye movement desensitization reprocessing, where you're using your eyes and other tapping methods, and more are coming out to kind of do that integrative piece to get whatever is in us out. And so so when, especially in our community, that happened 20 years ago, girl, you don't have to talk about that. It's like, no, you do. Because I always tell my students, if you don't work it out, it'll work out through you, and
amen.
not often the best
Amen.
way.
Amen.
That's
Also
right.
in harmful ways.
Mhm. And it's such a complex topic. You can't even speak to it in depth in a 30-minute podcast, but I think what you're saying is the message we're trying to drive home is you cannot suppress it. It's not time heals all wounds without you have to actually work. Healing is not passive. It requires the pain I always say it hurts to heal. And having to do that work and feel the painful emotions is something that you have to do in order to get to a better place. But as we are wrapping up, I have so many other questions, but I'm going to make sure that we just tie it up with this and talking about the healing practice, talking about the healing for the clergy person or the person in leadership who actually might have engaged in sexual misconduct, and then also the healing for the individual who survived that, who was the victim and now is a survivor, I like to say that, of whatever took place. Can the both of you, in this question, whoever wants to pick this up first, I guess I can start with Dr. Perry, and then Dr. Pierre, you
Yes,
bring us home.
absolutely. Mhm.
What would you say can we do to help to create healing?
Well, just three things real quickly. Number one, we must believe the survivor. We cannot diminish the survivor. Critical. Number two, we need to build systems in our church that help our churches know how to respond before something happens, not wait until it happens. And then number three, we need to understand that we need resources for both the person who has perpetrated as well as those who have been abused that we can make readily accessible and available to them, especially in the African American church. We don't we don't tend to go to counseling for whatever reason. Now that might be changing more. Dr. Pierre would know the details on that, but we tend to bury stuff. Okay, I'm almost 70 years old, so I come from a different generation where your family secret stayed secret, and it's horrible. So, so number one, we need to make sure we really embrace and believe the victim. Number two, we need to prepare our churches to develop structures and systems before something happens. And then number three, provide resources we've already vetted when something does happen. Those would be three quick things that I would say.
Very practical. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dr. Perry. And Dr. Pierre, can you bring us home as it relates to that question?
I just want to have a just I want to directly speak to survivors actually right now who've experienced that. So for those of you listening who for whom this has been your story, um, I'm sorry. That should not have happened to you. And for those of you who still struggle, what did I do to deserve this? And I would say nothing. You did nothing. And someone abused their power and to hurt you, especially when you were very, very vulnerable. And so may you know that God sees you and loves you. May God provide you with the right people right now in this season to bring your healing. That you're not forgotten. You're not forgotten. And so may you just feel encouraged, even in this day, that God's got you and that you did nothing wrong and it was not your fault. Just to really want to emphasize, I always tell my students, like, God has not called you to do this ministry alone. So, pastors, do your work. Please do your work. It's all right. I know it's hard, but and there are so many counselors. The ministry that Reverend Jocelyn's doing can connect you. It's okay if you're struggling. You're most vulnerable when you're burning out.
Amen. Amen.
So, because it's like you're kind of intoxicated, and so you're not on your game. So, if you're feeling that, don't wait for the thing to happen. Get some help now. The Lord is if you're feeling just listen to that nudge and get some support.
Amen.
Okay. The other thing is preach on this. Preach on the body, sexual violence, and on sex. These are important. And people have these really Sexual violence is not sex, it's about power. Let's distinguish those things. And whenever I've tested, like even to this day, when I ask students, when's the last time you heard a sermon on sexual violence or abuse? They're like, quiet, crickets. So it's our responsibility. And there are scriptures to, the Bible, it doesn't sanitize these things. So let us use it in a way that really encourages and exposes the reality of this. And then trainings. I think pastors need to go to trainings. It's okay. Like, so you're aware. Like I always say, you never want to go to the surgery and doctors are trying to, where's the scalpel? What am I going to do? Things are prepared. It's like you want to be prepared. Like, okay, this is what we do. Here's the support that we need. Here's if something happens, someone on your team has done something. How are we going to navigate this? This is the systems that Dr. Perry is talking about, because that creates more anxiety when you don't even know what to do or who's in your community or what the supports are in your community. And so be prepared. I think that brings a lot of integrity to the work that God has called you to do.
Wonderful answers. I wish I could have you on the show, like, to talk for so many hours about this, but I guess because you blessed us with a book, I got my copy here. So if anyone's interested in learning more, we encourage you to get Even the Best of Us off of Amazon. Uh, that was written by two incredible people. Thank you so much for your sacrifice, for your obedience and saying yes to writing this book. I believe is going to help so many people, for them to recognize that they're not alone, but they can also be a part of creating safe communities of healing, guarding against this type of sexual misconduct. So thank you for being on the show and accepting my invitation. I'm
Oh,
really
thank
grateful.
you, Reverend Jocelyn. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all for tuning into this episode of Faith on the Journey. I hope you were encouraged and blessed by it. And if you are a survivor of this type of experience, remember that you are not alone and there are resources available for you. If you are looking for a Christian counselor, please consider us by visiting faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please, first of all, subscribe and share it with a friend. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, then leave a 5-star review. That's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, you stay encouraged and you keep your faith on the journey. I'll see you soon, family.